Does Social Security need saving? Providing for retirees throughout the 21st century by Dimitri Papadimitriou and L. Randall Wray. The Trustees Report on Actuarial Status. Most people think of Social Security as a retirement program, but, in reality, the Social Security system comprises several different programs. Old Age and Survivors Insurance, OASI, the Hospital Insurance, HI portion of Medicare, Supplemental Medical Insurance, SMI, and Disability Insurance, DI. Most economic analyses combine OASI and DI into OASDI, since the financial operations of both programs are handled through special trust funds, the Federal Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund and the Federal Disability Insurance Trust Fund, established at the Treasury. Many of the programs included under the rubric of Social Security are not targeted to the retired, and even OASI has large numbers of beneficiaries who are not retired. For example, in 1997, nearly 10.5 million, almost 28% of the 37.8 million beneficiaries of OASI were spouses or survivors of covered workers. This must be kept in mind when evaluating Social Security. It cannot be treated as if it were nothing more than a pension fund, as is often done in money's worth calculations, briefly discussed below. We do focus on OASDI as a retirement program in this brief, but remain fully aware that it is much more than that. Our interest in this aspect of the program is based on the remarkable volume of debate and the intensity of the crisis mentality that the impending retirement of the baby boom generation has engendered. It has long been known that the United States and most other developed economies will face a demographic imbalance by 2020 or 2030. As a result of declining fertility rates, increasing longevity, and the baby boom bulge, the number of retirees relative to the working population will rise. In anticipation of this imbalance, revisions in benefits and revenues were made in 1977 and 1983 that fundamentally changed the Social Security program from pay-as-you-go to advance funding or the accumulation of reserves. It was believed that benefits could be supplemented by these reserves when Social Security revenues begin to fall short of expenditures. Section 201(c)(2) of the Social Security Act requires that the Social Security Board of Trustees make an annual report on the operations and status of the OASI and DI trust funds. This includes requirements that the trustees estimate the status of the funds for the ensuing 5 years and provide a statement of the actuarial status of the trust funds. In recent years, the trustees have provided a statement of the financial situation of the previous year, a detailed projection for the next 10 years, its short-range forecast, and a projection for the next 75 years, its long-range forecast, to capture the effects of demographic shifts in working and retiring cohorts. In the trustees' own words, the choice of the 75-year horizon will include the entire working and retired lifespan of the great majority of workers now contributing to the program, as well as those now receiving benefits. Because the trustees recognize the inherent difficulties in making projections over such a long time span, they use 3 sets of costs: high cost, pessimistic; intermediate cost; and low cost, optimistic. It is important to note that the Social Security Act does not require actuarial balance for the 75-year period. The trustees have established their own methods for assessing actuarial status and their own rules for solvency and liquidity of the funds. These rules are rather complex, but essentially the rules for solvency require that the fund's projected income expressed as a percent of taxable payroll, does not fall below 95% of their projected expenditures, also expressed as a percent of taxable payroll over the 75-year period. To provide sufficient liquidity to ensure timely payments, the rules require a contingency reserve of 8 to 9% of program expenditures. In recent years, the trustees have reported the actuarial status as the difference between the summarized income rate, the ratio of the present value of payroll taxes to the present value of taxable payroll, and the summarized cost rate, the ratio of the present value of expenditures to the present value of the taxable payroll, over the valuation period. When the summarized income rate equals the summarized cost rate, the discounted expenditures equal the discounted revenues over the valuation period. If the difference between the summarized income rate and the summarized cost rate is a positive number, the OASDI is said to be in actuarial balance. If the difference is a negative number, OASDI is in actuarial imbalance. The trustees have traditionally allowed some tolerance because of the inherent difficulty in making long-range projections. The program is said to be in close actuarial balance if estimated income over the 75-year period is within 5% of estimated cost. Currently, that 5% tolerance would equal about 0.75% of taxable payroll. Advisory Council on Social Security, 1997b, page 80. In other words, if OASDI had an actuarial gap of negative 0.75, it would still be said to be in close actuarial balance. Table 1 shows the income rate, cost rate, and resulting actuarial status for each of these three projections. Footnote 1. Throughout this paper, we use estimates and projections from the 1999 Annual Report of the Trustees, Social Security Administration, 1999. End footnote. The low-cost projection results in a positive actuarial balance for the first and second 25-year periods and the entire long-range 75-year period. The intermediate cost projection results in a positive actuarial balance for the first 25-year period only and a negative actuarial balance of 2.07% over the 75-year period. The high-cost projection for the 75-year period shows a negative 4.97% balance. What these estimates indicate is that if payroll taxes were immediately increased by 2.07 percentage points in the intermediate case, or by 4.97 percentage points in the high case, OASDI would be in positive actuarial balance for the 75-year period. For example, if the tax on both employees and employers were raised by 1.035 percentage points today, on intermediate projections, the coming financial crisis would vanish. Furthermore, if we take into consideration the tolerance rule, which permits a shortfall of 0.75, the intermediate projection of actuarial status is within 1.32%, 2.07 less 0.75, of close actuarial balance, so that the tax need be increased by only 0.66% on both employers and employees to bring OASDI into close actuarial balance. We will return to our assessment of the usefulness of such calculations later. The OASDI program's operating surplus for 1998 amounted to $107 billion. The intermediate projection shows a surplus rising to just under $125 billion in 1999 and to $193 billion by 2008. The last year of the short-range forecast, Figure 1. By the end of 1998, the trust funds had accumulated $887 billion. See Table 2 for more detail. This will grow, according to the intermediate estimate, to approximately $2.3 trillion by the end of 2008, with an annual surplus of $193 billion, an amount that is nearly 4 times estimated total program expenditures for the year 2007. That is to say, the trust funds would be sufficient to finance the program for well over 3 years, even with no tax revenues at the end of the first decade of the next millennium. For comparison, the low-cost estimate for 2008 is a surplus of $259 billion and a fund accumulation of $2.66 trillion. The high-cost estimate for 2008 is a surplus of $137 billion and an accumulation of $2.08 trillion. Thus, regardless of the assumptions used, OASDI is projected to run large surpluses and to accumulate huge trust funds throughout the next decade. Even the most pessimistic projections result in trust funds that by the end of 2008 would be well over what would be required to finance the program for 2 years with no additional revenue. Under the intermediate assumptions, see Table 2, the trustees project that through 2020, the trust funds will grow to $4.4 trillion. Beginning in 2022, program revenues will fall short of expenditures, requiring sales of trust fund assets. The assets would be exhausted by the year 2034, after which projected revenues would meet just under 3/4 of expenditures. Under the low-cost assumptions, however, the funds will rise to over 5 times annual program expenditures in 2020, fall to over 3 times in 2060, but remain fairly constant thereafter. By 2075, the funds would hold more than $45 trillion in assets. What is important to notice is the apparent incongruity between a balanced federal government budget, as projected by the Council of Economic Advisors, and growing trust funds, which on current practice must buy government securities. Each year, Social Security runs a surplus. That surplus adds to total government revenue, thus reducing a general budget deficit or adding to a surplus. Because Social Security funds are put in the general budget in exchange for Treasury securities, and the trust funds are credited with non-marketable Treasury securities that earn interest. Even on the intermediate cost projections, by year 2020, the trust funds would have to invest over $4.4 trillion in government securities, an amount greater than the currently outstanding publicly held government debt. On low-cost projections, the trust funds would have to purchase $45 trillion of government securities by 2075. To meet this higher goal, the federal government would have to issue new debt in excess of $150 billion a year by 2000, nearly $1 trillion a year by 2060, and almost $2 trillion a year by 2075. Thus, even if the federal budget remained balanced from this day forward, the Treasury would become increasingly indebted to OASDI. If the federal budget actually ran a surplus over the next 25 years, as the President believes it will, the debt in the hands of the public would be retired, but it would be replaced by debt held by Social Security. This is essentially a debt the government owes itself. We will return to this point later, as it relates to the President's plan for saving Social Security.